The restaurant buzzed with wealth and laughter, but when an old black woman stepped inside, the mood shifted. Whispers turned into mocking smiles, and soon, laughter rippled through the room, aimed at her. She was out of place, they thought, not worthy of this setting. They had no idea that by the end of the night she would leave them utterly humbled and ashamed. Watch how one act of quiet strength turns humiliation into a powerful lesson, and reminds us all of the unstoppable force of grace. The restaurant buzzed with the hum of casual conversation, the soft clinking of silverware against fine china, blending with the gentle jazz music floating through the air. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the elegant dining room, highlighting polished wood floors and white linen tablecloths. Waiters, dressed in crisp uniforms, moved with practiced grace between tables filled with diners who exuded affluence. The air carried a faint aroma of freshly baked bread and expensive wine, a scent that spoke of exclusivity and privilege. Eleanor pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped inside. She paused for a moment, allowing her eyes to adjust to the soft glow of the room. She stood out in her simplicity, an older black woman in a modest navy dress, her hair neatly styled, her shoes polished but practical. In her hand she clutched a small, worn handbag that seemed out of place among the sleek clutches and designer purses scattered on nearby tables. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, but there was an unmistakable air of dignity about her, as if she carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of stories in her posture. As she walked past the maitre d', heads began to turn. A group of young diners seated near the center of the room exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder with every step Eleanor took. She was acutely aware of the stares, the way they lingered just a beat too long, but she kept her chin high. When she reached a small table by the window, she paused, resting her hand briefly on the back of the chair before sitting down. The whispers behind her turned into quiet snickers. One of the young women in the group, dressed in a sleek red dress, leaned closer to her companions. "What's she doing here?" she murmured, loud enough for her voice to carry. "Looks like she walked into the wrong place." Another voice chimed in, this one male and slightly hesitant. "Maybe she's meeting someone. Her granddaughter, maybe?" "Please," the woman in red scoffed, flipping her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. "This isn't the kind of place you bring your grandma for tea." Eleanor heard them, every word. Her hand tightened around the strap of her handbag for a brief moment before she set it gently on the table. A waiter approached, offering her the menu with a practiced smile. She met his eyes, her gaze steady, and nodded her thanks as she took the menu. Her movements were measured, deliberate, as if she were deliberately refusing to acknowledge the laughter blooming behind her. She scanned the menu, though she already knew what she would order. This wasn't her first time here. She had been coming to this restaurant every year, on this very date, for nearly a decade. The same table by the window, the same meal, the same ritual. Tonight was no different, but the stares felt heavier this time, the whispers sharper, the laughter louder. As she set the menu down, she allowed herself a brief glance around the room. Couples leaned in close, sharing intimate conversations. Families laughed together over shared plates of dessert. The group of young diners at the center of the room caught her eye. The woman in red noticed her gaze and smirked, raising her glass in a mocking toast. Eleanor held her gaze for a moment before turning her attention back to the window. Outside, the city lights sparkled against the night sky, a reminder of the world beyond this insulated room. The waiter returned, pen poised over his notepad. Eleanor ordered tea and a light salad, her voice soft but firm. As he walked away, she adjusted the brooch on her dress, a simple gold piece shaped like a rose, its edges slightly tarnished with age. It was her anchor, a gift from someone who once told her she deserved to be in every room she entered, no matter who was watching. The laughter behind her grew louder, and for the briefest moment Eleanor's fingers hovered over the brooch before she clasped her hands in her lap. She wouldn't let them see her falter. Not tonight. Not ever. The waiter returned with her tea, setting the delicate porcelain cup on the table with a slight tremor in his hand. Eleanor noticed the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the quick dart of his eyes toward the group behind her. He hesitated, as if searching for the right words, before finally offering a polite smile. "Is there anything else I can get for you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor looked up at him, her gaze calm but piercing. "No, thank you, this will be fine," she replied, her voice steady, its softness carrying an unshakable strength. He nodded, retreating quickly, though not before casting a nervous glance toward the young diners. Eleanor followed his gaze briefly before lifting her tea, savoring the warmth as it seeped through the cup into her hands. Behind her, the laughter swelled again, sharper this time. The woman in red, now emboldened, leaned back in her chair, her voice rising above the room's quiet murmur. "I mean, honestly, who comes to a place like this and orders a salad? Did she miss the sign on the door?" Her words dripped with mockery, punctuated by the laughter of her companions. The man beside her shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowing. "Emma, maybe you should—" "Oh, relax, Ryan," she interrupted, her tone dismissive. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." Eleanor sipped her tea, her expression unchanged. She focused on the window, the city beyond the glass offering a soothing distraction from the sharp edges of their words. She had faced worse in her lifetime. Far worse. These moments, as cruel as they were, had become like static noise in the background of her life. But tonight, something about the tone, the unabashed boldness of their mockery, felt different. Her mind wandered to another time, another place, a dimly lit diner in the Deep South years ago when she and Charles had been turned away at the door. "No room for folks like you," the owner had said, his eyes hard, his arms crossed. Charles had placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. "Someday, Ellie," he had whispered as they walked away. "They'll learn. Not today, but someday." The memory stirred something deep within her, a flicker of the fire that had carried her through decades of indignities and triumphs. She adjusted the brooch on her dress again, her fingers lingering on its familiar edges. "Not today," she murmured softly to herself, her voice barely audible above the hum of the room. "But perhaps tonight." From the corner of her eye, she noticed the young waiter, standing near the kitchen doors and watching her. There was an apology in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the injustice playing out in front of him. She offered him a faint smile, a gesture of understanding, before returning her attention to the city lights. She had no intention of leaving early. If these children thought they could rattle her, they were sorely mistaken. As she reached for her tea again, the group behind her erupted into another bout of laughter, this time louder, bolder, unrestrained. The room grew quieter around them as other diners began to take notice. Eleanor remained still, her hands steady, her expression composed. Inside, however, the decision had already been made. Tonight, they would learn. The laughter continued, unabashed and grating, rippling through the air like the sharp edge of a blade. Eleanor felt the eyes of other diners dart toward her, some curious, others uncomfortable. She imagined their thoughts, their silent debates. Should someone say something? Should they pretend not to notice? Most chose the latter, their attention drifting back to their meals as though erasing the moment could absolve them of complicity. Eleanor's tea had grown cold by the time the waiter returned, his shoulders hunched and his expression wary. He leaned in slightly, speaking in a voice meant only for her. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry about—" He trailed off, his words faltering as if he didn't quite know how to finish. "Is there anything I can do?" he finally asked, his tone laced with genuine concern. Eleanor's lips curved into a small, reassuring smile. "You're doing just fine, young man," she said gently, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had seen far more than she cared to burden him with. "Thank you." The waiter hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the center of the room where the group of young diners still sat, oblivious to the growing tension in the air. "If they're bothering you, I could—" "No," she interrupted softly but firmly. "Let them have their moment." The young man nodded reluctantly and retreated, but not before Eleanor noticed the way his hands clenched at his sides. his frustration poorly disguised. She sighed inwardly, grateful for his concern, but unwilling to let anyone fight her battles tonight. This wasn't a night for anger. It was a night for something far more enduring. She reached into her handbag, her fingers brushing against the leather-bound planner she carried everywhere. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, reminders, and personal reflections, her guide to the life she had built with quiet determination. She pulled out a small envelope tucked inside, her thumb running along its sealed edge. Written on the front, in Charles's familiar scrawl, were the words, "For the moments that test your spirit." Her heart tightened as she held it. She hadn't opened it in years, not since the first anniversary of his passing. Tonight, though, felt like the right moment. Slowly, she slipped her nail beneath the flap and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. His words, written with the same care he had shown in life, leapt off the page. "Ellie, remember that grace will always outlast cruelty. Let them see the power of your kindness. It's the only lesson worth teaching." She read the words twice, then folded the letter carefully and placed it back in her bag. When she looked up again, the group of young diners was still laughing, their jokes now more pointed and crude, their voices louder as if daring her to react. The woman in red, Emma, leaned back in her chair and tilted her head toward Eleanor, a smirk playing on her lips. "What do you think she's even doing here? Maybe she's looking for the senior discount." The others erupted into laughter, but Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, she placed her hands on the table, smoothing the linen cloth beneath her palms, and turned toward the waiter, who stood nearby, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Excuse me," she called to him, her voice carrying across the room with quiet authority. The waiter approached quickly, leaning down to hear her better. She spoke softly, but her words were deliberate, each one infused with calm resolve. "Could you bring me the bill for everyone?" The young man froze, his brows knitting in confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, you mean—" "Yes," she said simply, her tone leaving no room for doubt. "For everyone in this room, I'd like to pay for it." The waiter blinked, his eyes wide with disbelief. Are you sure?" Eleanor's smile deepened, though her eyes remained steady. "Quite sure, dear. And when you're finished, please bring their receipt to my table." She nodded toward the group of young diners, her gaze unyielding. "I'd like to add a note." The young man hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. "Right away, ma'am," he said, his voice tinged with awe. As he hurried off, Eleanor turned her attention back to the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. Her fingers brushed against the brooch on her chest, its cool metal a steadying presence. Kindness, she reminded herself. Grace. Tonight they would learn. The din of the restaurant seemed to soften, as if the room itself sensed the shift in Eleanor's resolve. She sat back in her chair, her hands resting lightly on the table, her face calm but contemplative. Outside, the city lights shimmered, their glow reflected in the glass pane before her. She let her thoughts drift for a moment, allowing the memory of Charles's words to anchor her. At the center of the room, the group of young diners continued their raucous chatter, oblivious to the quiet strength that had taken root just a few tables away. Emma leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "I mean, really," she said with a smirk. "Do you think she even knows how to read the menu? Probably thought she was ordering off the dollar menu." The others laughed again, though Ryan's chuckle faltered. He glanced at Eleanor, his expression uneasy. "Maybe we should tone it down," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the laughter, but Emma waved him off with a dismissive flick of her hand. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes. "It's not like she can hear us, and even if she can, what's she going to do? Write us a strongly worded letter?" Sophie, seated to Emma's left, hesitated, her fork hovering over her plate. She looked at Emma, then at Eleanor, her brow furrowing. "I don't know, Em. She hasn't done anything to us. Maybe we should just—" "Stop worrying so much," Emma interrupted, her tone sharp. "Honestly, it's just a joke. Don't be so sensitive." The conversation shifted again, but Sophie's discomfort lingered. She glanced at Eleanor once more, her gaze lingering on the older woman's composed expression. Something about her felt unshakable, as if she were made of steel wrapped in silk. Meanwhile, the waiter reappeared at Eleanor's table, clutching a small notebook in his hand. He leaned down, speaking quietly so as not to draw attention. "Ma'am, the bill has been prepared. Would you like me to place the charges on a single receipt?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, thank you, and after that, I'd like you to bring me a pen." The young man's lips parted, as though he were about to ask another question, but something in her gaze stopped him. He nodded quickly and disappeared into the kitchen. Eleanor returned her focus to the window, her fingers brushing against the edge of her teacup as the soft jazz music floated through the air. The moment stretched, slow and deliberate as she waited. She could feel the curiosity brewing in the room. A couple at a nearby table whispered to each other, their eyes darting between Eleanor and the waiter bustling toward the kitchen. A man in a tailored suit stole a glance at her over the rim of his wine glass. She was no stranger to being watched, but tonight, the attention didn't weigh on her. Tonight, it was her choice to be seen. The waiter returned swiftly, placing the receipt and a pen on the table. Eleanor reached for them, her movements deliberate. She scanned the bill, her brow raising slightly at the total, an amount that might have made others gasp, but she merely nodded. With a calm hand, she signed her name, then flipped the receipt over and began to write on the back. Her words flowed easily, each letter sharp and precise. When she finished, she set the pen down, folded the receipt neatly, and handed it back to the waiter. "Please deliver this to the group at the center table," she said, her voice steady but carrying a quiet authority. "And let them know their bill has been paid." The waiter hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the group of young diners. He swallowed hard, then gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice almost reverent. As he walked away, Eleanor took a sip of her tea, the cool liquid now matching the room's energy. She could feel the ripple starting, the first stirrings of unease among the diners who had dared to mock her. She didn't need to see their faces to know what was coming. The moment had been set into motion, and there was no turning back. Her gaze drifted once more to the window, where the city lights blinked like distant stars. Tonight, they would not forget her. Tonight, they would understand. The waiter approached the center table cautiously, the receipt tucked neatly in his hand. His steps faltered slightly as he neared, his gaze darting between the diners and the folded paper he carried. The group continued their lively chatter, oblivious to his approach until he cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in his posture. The laughter at the table tapered off, and all eyes turned to him. "I've been asked to deliver this to your table." Emma raised an eyebrow, her manicured fingers reaching for the slip of paper. She unfolded it with a flick of her wrist, her expression one of mild annoyance. As her eyes scanned the receipt, her expression shifted, confusion flickering across her features. "What is this?" she asked, holding up the paper for the group to see. "Is this some kind of joke?" Ryan leaned over to take a closer look, his brow furrowing as he read the note scrawled on the back. The words were simple, but their weight was undeniable. "Grace is a choice. Tonight I chose it for all of us. Eleanor." Emma's cheeks flushed as the realization sank in. She flipped the receipt over, her eyes widening at the total. "She paid for everything?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and indignation. The rest of the group exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier confidence crumbling under the weight of the gesture. Ryan sat back in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. "She paid for everyone in the restaurant," he said quietly, his tone carrying both awe and discomfort. "Not just us, everyone." Sophie, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, reached for the receipt. Her fingers trembled slightly as she read the note again. "Why would she do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma scoffed, though her voice lacked its usual sharpness. "Maybe she's trying to make a point. Or maybe she just wants attention." "Or maybe," Sophie countered, her tone uncharacteristically firm, "she's showing us what we failed to see." The table fell silent, the weight of Sophie's words settling over them like a heavy blanket. Around them, the atmosphere in the restaurant began to shift. Other diners, having overheard snippets of the exchange, cast glances toward Eleanor's table. The quiet hum of conversation was tinged with curiosity and respect, the mockery that had once filled the air replaced by an unspoken reverence. Eleanor, for her part, remained seated, her gaze fixed on the window. She didn't look back at the group, nor did she acknowledge the ripple her actions had caused. She simply sipped her tea, her demeanor as serene as it had been when she first entered the restaurant. But even without turning, she could feel the change. It wasn't just the silence at the center table or the stolen glances from other diners. It was something deeper, something intangible, a quiet understanding that had begun to take root in the room. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her earlier bravado now a faint shadow of itself. "Well," she said finally, her voice strained, "I guess we should say, thank you?" Ryan gave her a sharp look. "You think that's enough?" he asked, his tone pointed. "After everything you said tonight?" Emma's mouth opened to respond, but no words came. Instead, she sat back in her chair, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Sophie, however, stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She clutched the receipt in her hand as she took a step away from the table, her eyes fixed on Eleanor. "I'm going to thank her," Sophie said quietly, her voice trembling slightly but resolute. "Properly." The others watched as she made her way toward Eleanor's table, her steps hesitant but determined. The room seemed to hold its breath, every pair of eyes following her as she approached the older woman who had single-handedly transformed the evening. Eleanor didn't turn when Sophie stopped a few feet from her table. She simply waited, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her posture as poised as ever. Sophie swallowed hard, the weight of her own shame pressing against her chest like a stone. "Ma'am," Sophie began, her voice cracking slightly. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did, and to apologize for the things we said." She paused, her gaze dropping to the floor. "For the way we treated you." Eleanor turned slowly, her eyes meeting Sophie's. There was no anger in her gaze, no trace of the indignation Sophie had feared. Instead, there was warmth, tempered by a wisdom that made Sophie feel like a child standing before a teacher. "Apologies are not for me," Eleanor said softly, her voice steady but kind. "They're for yourself. What you choose to do with them will determine who you become." Sophie's breath caught, and for a moment she could only nod. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor offered her a small smile, one that carried more understanding than words ever could. "You're welcome, child," she said gently. Then, with a slight nod toward the table Sophie had left behind, she added, "Go back to your friends. They'll need you tonight." Sophie hesitated but finally turned and walked away, her steps lighter, though her heart felt heavier with reflection. As she rejoined the table, Emma looked at her face unreadable, while Ryan watched her with quiet approval. The room remained hushed, the ripple of Eleanor's actions continuing to spread. And Eleanor? She turned back to her tea, the city lights once again claiming her attention. Tonight was only beginning, but the lesson had already taken root. The room felt heavier now, not with tension, but with the unspoken weight of Eleanor's gesture. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, diners casting sidelong glances at her table, their expressions a mix of admiration and guilt. The laughter that had once punctuated the air from Emma's group had vanished, replaced by an uneasy silence. At the center table, Emma fidgeted, her fingers twisting the stem of her wine glass. She didn't look at Sophie, who had returned to her seat with her eyes lowered, nor at Ryan, whose disappointment in her was palpable. Instead, she stared at the receipt still lying on the table, its folded edge almost taunting her. For the first time in a long while, Emma felt small, insignificant. It was a feeling she wasn't accustomed to, and she hated it. Ryan leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and finally broke the silence. "She didn't have to do that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "She didn't owe us anything, and yet..." She made us look like fools, Emma muttered, her voice barely audible. No, Sophie interrupted softly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She made us see ourselves. Emma glanced up sharply, her lips pressed into a thin line. What's that supposed to mean? Sophie met her gaze, her own steady and unwavering. It means we've been sitting here acting like we own the world, laughing at someone we don't even know, just because we think we're better than her. Her voice trembled slightly, but she pushed on. And she still showed us more kindness in one night than we've probably shown anyone in weeks. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her tongue. For all her quick wit and biting comebacks, she couldn't find a way to refute Sophie's words. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the receipt, her jaw tightening as shame began to seep into her carefully constructed facade. At the other tables, diners continued to observe the group in subtle glances, some leaning toward each other to whisper about what had just transpired. It was clear that Eleanor's actions had sent ripples far beyond the young diner's table. A man in a tailored suit gestured for the waiter, his voice low but insistent as he asked for Eleanor's name. A young couple at a nearby table exchanged looks, their conversation suddenly focused on the meaning of generosity and grace. Eleanor remained serene, her teacup resting lightly between her hands. She felt the energy of the room shifting, the ripple of her actions spreading further than even she had anticipated. But she didn't turn to meet their stares, didn't bask in the attention she'd quietly commanded. This wasn't about her. It never had been. The waiter approached again, his steps hesitant but purposeful. He stopped at her table, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. "Ma'am," he began, his voice soft. "A few other guests have asked about you." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into a faint smile. "What have they asked, young man?" The waiter hesitated as though unsure how to phrase his next words. "They want to know who you are, what you do. One guest even asked if you're someone famous." Eleanor let out a quiet chuckle, a warm, rich sound that seemed to fill the space around her. "Famous?" she repeated, her tone amused. "Hardly. I'm just an old woman who knows the value of a lesson well taught." The waiter blinked, caught off guard by her humility. "Well, whatever you are, ma'am," he said sincerely, "you've left an impression tonight. On all of us." Eleanor inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Kindness has a way of doing that," she said simply. "It lingers long after the moment has passed." The waiter nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips before he turned and walked away, his steps lighter than they'd been all night. Eleanor watched him go, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She had lived long enough to understand the ripple effect of small actions, how a single drop of kindness could spread farther than one might ever see. At the center table, Emma finally broke the silence again, her voice softer now, almost unsure. "What do we do now?" she asked, looking at Ryan and Sophie as though searching for an answer she couldn't find on her own. Sophie glanced at Eleanor's table, her expression thoughtful. "We start by doing better," she said simply. "And maybe we say thank you, for real this time." Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It's the least we can do." Emma hesitated, her pride warring with the growing realization that Sophie and Ryan were right. Finally, she let out a small sigh, setting her wine glass down with a soft clink. "Fine," she said, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "Let's go." The three of them rose from their seats, their movements tentative, and began making their way toward Eleanor's table. The other diners watched them, the quiet anticipation in the room growing as they approached the woman who had, without raising her voice or her hand, changed the course of their evening. And perhaps their lives. Eleanor sensed them approaching before she saw them. Their hesitant steps, the soft shuffle of their shoes against the polished floor, spoke volumes. She didn't turn immediately, instead taking a moment to savor the last sip of her tea, letting the warm liquid settle before placing the cup down with deliberate care. Only then did she glance up, her calm gaze meeting the group standing before her table. Emma, Ryan, and Sophie stood awkwardly, their earlier bravado reduced to a shared silence. Sophie clutched the receipt in her hands, her knuckles white against the thin paper. Ryan shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the floor. Emma, for all her poise, seemed smaller somehow, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if shielding herself from her own shame. Eleanor regarded them with quiet patience, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush to speak, letting the weight of the moment stretch until it demanded action. Finally, Sophie stepped forward, her voice trembling but earnest. "Ma'am," she began, her eyes meeting Eleanor's. We came to say thank you for what you did, and—" She faltered for a moment, her gaze dropping to the folded receipt in her hands. "And to apologize for the way we treated you." Eleanor studied her for a long moment, her silence heavy but not unkind. "And what way was that?" she asked gently, her tone inviting but firm. Sophie swallowed hard, glancing back at Emma and Ryan for support before looking at Eleanor again. "We judged you," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. We thought you didn't belong here, and we made jokes about it. Cruel ones." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, her eyes softening as she took in Sophie's trembling hands, the vulnerability etched across her face. She let the words settle before speaking. "And now you see differently?" "Yes," Sophie said quickly, her voice filled with conviction. "We were wrong, and I'm sorry, truly." Eleanor nodded slowly, then shifted her gaze to Ryan. He stepped forward, his expression earnest. "She's right," he said, his voice quieter but no less sincere. "We were out of line. You didn't deserve any of it. And the way you responded—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It taught me something, more than I expected to learn tonight." Eleanor's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Finally, she turned her attention to Emma, who remained rooted in place, her arms still tightly crossed. Emma met Eleanor's gaze, her face a mixture of defiance and discomfort. For a moment, it seemed she might not speak at all, but then she let out a long breath, uncrossing her arms and letting them fall to her sides. "I don't know what to say," Emma admitted, her voice softer than it had been all night. "I'm not used to being wrong, or apologizing for it." Eleanor's smile deepened slightly, though her tone remained steady. "An apology is only meaningful if it comes from the heart, not out of obligation." Emma's cheeks flushed and she looked away briefly, her confidence wavering. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I am sorry for the things I said, for how I acted. It wasn't right." Eleanor regarded her for a moment, her eyes searching Emma's face as though weighing the sincerity of her words. Then she nodded. "Thank you," she said simply, acknowledging it as the first step. The group visibly relaxed, the tension in their shoulders easing slightly. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She straightened in her chair, her tone taking on a quiet authority. "Kindness," she began, her voice measured, "is not a sign of weakness. It is strength. To offer it freely, even when it's undeserved, takes courage." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "But kindness also demands responsibility. What you choose to do with the lesson is what matters most. Will you carry it forward, or leave it behind as just another fleeting moment?" The group stood in silence, the weight of Eleanor's words pressing down on them. Sophie nodded first, her expression resolute. "I'll carry it forward," she said softly. "I promise." Ryan followed, his voice equally firm. "Me too. You've given us more than we deserve." Eleanor's gaze lingered on Emma, who shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. Finally, Emma nodded, her voice quiet but steady. "I'll try. I don't know if I'll get it right every time, but I'll try." Eleanor's expression softened, and she nodded in approval. "That's all anyone can do," she said gently. Then, with a small gesture, she motioned toward their table. "Go back to your friends. Tonight has been long, and there's still time to reflect." The group hesitated, as if unsure whether they were truly dismissed, but Eleanor's calm demeanor left no room for argument. They turned and began to make their way back to their table, their steps quieter, their postures more subdued. Eleanor watched them go, her fingers brushing against the edge of her brooch. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she turned back to her reflection in the window. Tonight, she thought, they had taken the first steps toward understanding, and that, in itself, was enough. As the group returned to their table, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted once more. Conversations, which had been muted and hesitant, resumed cautiously. Diners exchanged glances, some murmuring about Eleanor's quiet yet profound act, while others seemed lost in thought. The air carried a weight of introspection, a collective awareness that something significant had just transpired. Eleanor remained seated, her gaze fixed on the cityscape beyond the window. The shimmering lights felt distant yet familiar, a reminder of the countless nights she had spent navigating the complexities of life. Her reflection in the glass revealed a woman at peace, but her mind wandered to the past, to the moments that had shaped her resilience. She thought of Charles again, his broad smile, his warm laugh, and the unshakable optimism that had carried them through so many storms. It was his belief in her that had taught her to carry herself with dignity, even in the face of scorn. She could almost hear his voice now, a quiet echo in her mind. "Ellie, don't let them steal your light. They'll try, but don't you ever let them." Her reverie was interrupted by a soft voice at her side. "Excuse me, ma'am." Eleanor turned her head to see the young waiter standing there, his hands clasped in front of him. His expression was earnest, his eyes bright with something she couldn't quite place. Admiration, perhaps, or gratitude. "Yes," she said, her tone gentle. "I just wanted to say—" He hesitated, glancing around as if to ensure no one was listening. "What you did tonight, it was incredible. I've been working here for a while, and I've never seen anything like it." Eleanor smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Sometimes the smallest actions leave the biggest impressions," she said softly. "It's not about making a scene, it's about making a point." The waiter nodded, his gaze steady. "You made your point, ma'am. Not just to them, but to all of us." He paused, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I know it might be a little forward, but would you mind signing this, just your name, so I can remember tonight?" Eleanor chuckled, a warm and rich sound that seemed to envelop the young man. "You think I'm someone worth remembering?" she asked, though her tone carried no trace of arrogance, only quiet amusement. The waiter's face flushed and he nodded earnestly. "I do. You've reminded me what kindness looks like, what it feels like. I won't forget it." Touched by his sincerity, Eleanor took the notebook and pen he offered. She opened to a blank page and wrote her name in elegant, looping cursive. Beneath it, she added a short message. "Kindness always matters. Eleanor." Handing it back, she met his gaze. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The waiter looked at the page as if it were a treasure, then tucked it carefully into his pocket. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." As he walked away, Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. The ripple she had created tonight extended further than she had anticipated. It wasn't just the group at the center table. It was the staff, the other diners, perhaps even the city beyond these walls. Kindness, she knew, was infectious. It had a way of spreading far beyond the moment it was given. Her tea was gone, the cup empty, but Eleanor remained seated for a while longer. She wasn't in a hurry to leave. Tonight wasn't just about making a statement. It was about honoring the promise she had made to herself and to Charles, to live with grace, no matter the circumstances, to lead by example. The weight of the night began to lift, replaced by a calm sense of fulfillment. As the restaurant hummed softly around her, Eleanor allowed herself a small, contented sigh. She had done what she came to do, and now it was time to move on. Eleanor finally pushed her chair back, the gentle scrape of the legs against the polished wood floor drawing a few lingering glances. She stood slowly, her movements deliberate, and reached for her handbag. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, pausing to smooth the fabric of her dress. The room had quieted again, the energy shifting as her presence commanded attention without a word. As she turned toward the exit, her heels clicking softly against the floor, a voice called out behind her. "Ma'am?" It was Sophie, standing at her table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Can I ask you something?" Eleanor stopped and turned, her expression patient. "Of course, child." Sophie hesitated, her face a mixture of apprehension and sincerity. "Why did you do it? Why pay for everyone? Why us?" Her voice wavered slightly, as if she were afraid of the answer but needed to know all the same. Eleanor studied Sophie for a moment, her gaze steady and thoughtful. "Because grace is more powerful than anger," she said finally. Her voice carried across the room, soft but unwavering. "It isn't about you, or them, or even me. It's about setting a standard, showing what's possible when we choose kindness over cruelty." Sophie's eyes glistened, and she nodded slowly, her lips pressed together as though holding back tears. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Eleanor offered her a small, reassuring smile. "You're welcome, dear. Just remember, what you do with the lesson matters more than the lesson itself." With that, she turned again and continued toward the door. The rest of the restaurant watched in silence, their eyes following her graceful movements. Conversations had ceased entirely now, the air heavy with the unspoken weight of what had unfolded. As she neared the entrance, the maitre d' stepped forward, his usually formal demeanor softened. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said quietly, inclining his head, "it's always an honor to have you here. Tonight was extraordinary." Eleanor nodded in acknowledgement, her smile warm but modest. "Thank you," she replied, "and thank your staff for me. They handled the night with grace of their own." The maitre d' hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "If I may ask, will we see you again next year?" Eleanor's smile grew faintly wistful. "Perhaps," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet mystery, "if the occasion calls for it." She pushed open the heavy oak door and stepped out into the night. The cool air greeted her like an old friend, brushing against her skin and carrying with it the distant sounds of the city. She paused on the sidewalk, taking a moment to breathe in the crispness of the evening. Behind her, the restaurant remained a beacon of light and warmth, its windows glowing against the darkness. Eleanor knew the ripple of her actions would continue long after she was gone, spreading through the lives of those who had witnessed it tonight. It wasn't about recognition or praise. It was about planting seeds, small but meaningful, in the hearts of others. With her head held high, she began to walk, her steps steady and unhurried. The night stretched out before her, filled with infinite possibilities. And as she disappeared into the quiet embrace of the city, the lesson she had left behind lingered in the air, a testament to the enduring power of kindness. Eleanor walked along the quiet city street, the rhythm of her footsteps blending with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional murmur of voices from nearby alleyways. The weight of the evening was lifting, replaced by a sense of calm satisfaction. Her actions weren't meant to draw applause, yet the knowledge that she had left an indelible mark on the people in that restaurant filled her with quiet pride. As she passed a small boutique with its lights still glowing, Eleanor's gaze fell on the window display. A mannequin stood elegantly dressed, its outfit reminiscent of a style she once wore in her youth, sharp, tailored lines, and a vibrant scarf draped casually around its neck. It reminded her of the days when she and Charles would dress up and attend galas, despite knowing they would be the only black couple in the room. Charles always said, "Ellie, we don't go to be accepted. We go to show them what acceptance looks like." She smiled softly at the memory, her reflection in the glass merging with the mannequin's image for a fleeting moment. Time had passed, but the lessons had remained, etched into her very being. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps behind her. She turned, her composure undisturbed, as Sophie approached, slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Eleanor," she called, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and hesitation. "Wait, please." Eleanor paused, her expression curious but calm. "You shouldn't be running out here alone, child," she said, a note of concern in her voice. "What's on your mind?" Sophie slowed to a stop, clutching the folded receipt in her hand. Her face was flushed, but her eyes shone with determination. "I couldn't just let you leave without saying more," she began. I wanted to thank you again, properly this time. Not just for what you did tonight, but for showing me something I didn't know I needed to see." Eleanor regarded her for a moment, her gaze softening. "And what is it you saw, Sophie?" Sophie hesitated, glancing down at the receipt before meeting Eleanor's eyes. "I saw myself," she admitted quietly. "I saw how shallow I've been, how quick I've been to judge people without even knowing them, and I saw how much better I could be, if I tried." Eleanor nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "That's a powerful realization," she said, "but it's only the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight, child. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to confront yourself every day." Sophie bit her lip, nodding. "I know, and I want to try, I really do." She hesitated, then held out the receipt. "I thought about keeping this as a reminder, but I think it's better if you have it." Eleanor took the receipt gently, her fingers brushing against Sophie's. She unfolded it and glanced at the words she had written earlier. "Grace is a choice. Tonight I chose it for all of us." She smiled faintly, then folded it again and slipped it into her handbag. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I think you already carry the reminder where it matters most." She tapped lightly over Sophie's heart, her touch gentle but firm. Sophie blinked back tears, her voice trembling as she replied, "I'll remember this night for the rest of my life." Eleanor smiled, her warmth radiating in the cool night air. "Then my work here is done," she said lightly, though the depth of her words lingered in the space between them. Sophie stepped back, reluctant but knowing she had said what needed to be said. "Good night, Mrs. Eleanor," she said, her voice full of reverence. "Good night, child," Eleanor replied, watching as Sophie turned and walked back toward the restaurant. For a moment Eleanor stood still, her heart swelling with quiet pride. She had seen something shift in Sophie's eyes, a spark of understanding, a willingness to grow. And that spark, she knew, could ignite something far greater. With a final glance at the city lights, Eleanor resumed her walk, her steps purposeful and steady. The night still held its mysteries, but for Eleanor, it had already given her all she needed. Tonight, kindness had prevailed, and that was enough. Eleanor continued her stroll through the city, the sounds of the night embracing her like a familiar melody. She passed the glowing windows of cafes and the dimly lit stoops of brownstones, her mind replaying moments from the evening. Though she didn't seek validation, she felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not for herself, but for the lesson she had planted in the hearts of those who needed it most. Her pace slowed as she reached a small park nestled between two busy streets. The space was quiet, save for the rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. She walked toward a bench beneath a large oak tree and sat down, the weariness of the evening catching up to her. She set her handbag beside her, her fingers idly tracing the textured leather. The memories came unbidden now, sharp and vivid. She saw herself as a young woman, standing with Charles in the doorway of their first home, a modest, weather-worn house they had purchased with every penny they'd saved. She remembered the neighbors' suspicious glances, the whispered comments that followed them wherever they went. And yet, Charles had always smiled, his belief in the goodness of people unwavering. "They don't know us yet, Ellie," he had said one evening as they sat on the porch, the sunset casting golden hues across his face. "But they will, and when they do, they'll see there's nothing to fear, just two people trying to live their lives." She had envied his optimism then, her own heart heavy with the weight of the world's prejudices. But over time his hope had become hers. shaping the way she approached even the harshest moments. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of soft footsteps approaching. She looked up to see a young man standing a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. For a moment she didn't recognize him, but then his face softened into a tentative smile. "Ma'am," Ryan said quietly, his voice carrying a mix of nervousness and resolve. "I hope I'm not bothering you." Eleanor shook her head, gesturing to the bench beside her. "Not at all, young man. Sit down if you'd like." Ryan hesitated, then accepted her offer, perching on the edge of the bench as though unsure if he belonged there. He clasped his hands together, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I just wanted to say, thank you," he began, his voice steady but low. "Not just for what you did tonight, but for how you did it. You could have said something, called us out, embarrassed us in front of everyone. But you didn't. You showed us grace instead." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "And what did that teach you?" she asked gently. Ryan looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "It taught me that being kind doesn't mean being weak. That there's strength in taking the high road even when it's not easy." Eleanor nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. "That's a lesson some people spend their whole lives trying to learn. Hold on to it." Ryan nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I will," he said. "I've made mistakes, a lot of them. But tonight you made me realize it's never too late to change." Eleanor reached over, her hand resting lightly on his. "It's never too late," she said softly. "Every day is a new chance to do better, to be better." Ryan swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything." Eleanor gave his hand a gentle pat before withdrawing hers. "You're welcome, child. Now go on. There's a world out there waiting for you to make your mark." Ryan stood, his posture more assured now. "Good night, Mrs. Eleanor," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Good night, Ryan," she replied, watching as he walked away, his steps purposeful. She sat for a moment longer, the weight of her own words settling over her. She knew she wouldn't see him again, but the impact of their exchange would linger in both their lives. Eleanor rose from the bench, her movements slow but steady. She picked up her handbag, slinging it over her shoulder, and resumed her walk. The park's path wound through clusters of trees, their branches arching overhead like a protective canopy. The air was cooler now, the night deepening with each passing moment. She felt lighter somehow, as though the evening had lifted a burden she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Her thoughts drifted back to the restaurant, to Sophie and Ryan, and even to Emma. She hoped the seeds she had sown in their hearts would take root, growing into something meaningful. As she exited the park and stepped onto a quieter street, the faint sound of a saxophone reached her ears. She followed it instinctively, her steps leading her to a small jazz club tucked between two brownstones. Its neon sign flickered gently, casting a warm glow onto the sidewalk. Eleanor paused outside, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. She and Charles had once spent countless nights in places like this, losing themselves in the rhythm of the music and the magic of the moment. Without hesitation, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The dimly lit room was intimate, with small tables scattered around a stage where a lone musician played. The smooth, soulful notes filled the space, wrapping around Eleanor like an old friend. She found a seat near the back, settling in as the music washed over her. For the first time that evening, she allowed herself to simply be. No lessons, no gestures, no weighty reflections. Just the music, the memories, and the quiet comfort of knowing she had done her part. The dimly lit jazz club enveloped Eleanor in its warmth. The smooth notes of the saxophone swirled around her like a comforting embrace, their rhythm stirring memories that had lain dormant for years. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to drift back to a time when life was simpler, when she and Charles would steal away to places like this, where the music spoke louder than words. She could almost see him now, sitting across from her, his broad smile illuminated by the flickering candlelight. "Ellie," he had said during one such evening, his voice low and tender. The world may not always make room for us, but we'll carve our own space. And when we do, we'll fill it with everything that makes life worth living. Eleanor's lips curved into a soft smile at the memory. Charles had always been the dreamer, the one who saw endless possibilities even in the face of hardship. It was his spirit that had taught her to rise above, to respond to the world's unkindness with an unshakable grace. The music shifted, the tempo slowing as the saxophonist transitioned into a soulful ballad. The melody tugged at her heart, each note a reminder of moments shared and sacrifices made. Eleanor's hand moved to the brooch pinned to her dress, her fingers brushing over its familiar edges. It was her anchor, a symbol of the life she and Charles had built together. A life filled with love, resilience, and a deep understanding of what truly mattered. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling on the stage. The saxophonist caught her eye and nodded, his expression carrying a quiet respect. It was as if he could sense the weight of her thoughts, the depth of her journey. Eleanor inclined her head in return, her smile faint but genuine. A waiter appeared at her side, setting down a glass of sparkling water. "Compliments of the house," he said softly. "The manager wanted you to feel welcome." Eleanor looked up at him, her expression warm. "That's very kind. Please thank them for me." The waiter nodded and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Eleanor alone with the music and her memories. She took a sip of the water, the coolness refreshing as it slid down her throat. Tonight, she realized, wasn't just about teaching a lesson. It was also about honoring the past and carrying its wisdom into the present. The final notes of the ballad lingered in the air as the saxophonist stepped back, bowing slightly to the soft applause that rippled through the room. Eleanor clapped along with the others, her appreciation genuine. She felt a renewed sense of peace, as though the music had helped her release the last remnants of tension from the evening. As the applause faded, the club's manager approached her table, his demeanor polite but curious. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said, his tone respectful, "it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. Your presence has already made quite an impression." Eleanor smiled, setting her glass down. "I seem to have a knack for that," she replied, her voice tinged with humor. The manager chuckled softly, then hesitated. "If I may ask," he began, "what brings you here tonight? It's not often we're graced with someone of your stature." Eleanor tilted her head, her smile growing faintly enigmatic. "Sometimes a little music is all one needs to put the world in perspective," she said simply. "And tonight, perspective feels especially important." The manager nodded, as though her words carried a deeper meaning he couldn't quite grasp. "Well, if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Eleanor said, her tone gracious. "I'll let you know." The manager retreated, leaving her to the soft hum of conversation and the faint strains of music as the band prepared for their next set. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting across the room. She noticed a young couple seated near the stage, their hands intertwined as they whispered to each other. She saw a man at the bar nursing a glass of whiskey, his expression contemplative. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles and triumphs. And yet, they were all here, drawn together by the universal language of music and the quiet comfort of shared space. It reminded Eleanor of something Charles had often said. "We're all just trying to find a place where we belong. Sometimes that place isn't where we expected, but it's always where we're meant to be." As the band struck up a lively tune, Eleanor felt a spark of energy stir within her. She tapped her fingers lightly against the table, letting the rhythm guide her thoughts. Tonight she had found her place, not just in the restaurant or the park, but in the hearts of those who had crossed her path. And in doing so, she had carved a little more room for grace in the world. Eleanor lingered in the jazz club longer than she had intended. The music, vibrant and soulful, wove a tapestry of memories and emotions that felt too precious to leave behind. The band had shifted to a more upbeat tempo, the saxophone leading the charge, accompanied by a steady rhythm from the bass and the bright shimmer of cymbals. The room came alive with the sound, and Eleanor found herself swaying slightly in her chair, her fingers tapping against the edge of the table. Across the room, the young couple she had noticed earlier stood and moved toward the small space near the stage that served as a dance floor. The man extended his hand to the woman, and she accepted with a radiant smile. They began to dance, their movements unpolished but full of joy. Slowly, others joined, turning the intimate gathering into a celebration of music and life. Eleanor watched them, her chest tightening with a mix of nostalgia and quiet contentment. She remembered nights like this with Charles, the way he would pull her onto the floor, his laughter infectious as he spun her in playful circles. She had often protested, claiming she couldn't dance, but he would only grin and say, "You don't need to know how to dance, Ellie. You just need to know how to feel the music." A voice interrupted her reverie. "Excuse me, ma'am. May I have this dance?" Eleanor turned to see a gentleman standing beside her table, his hand extended. He was older, with salt and pepper hair and a kind smile that reached his eyes. His suit was simple but well-tailored, and he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, her smile tinged with amusement. "And what makes you think I can still keep up with the likes of you?" The man chuckled, his voice warm and inviting. "Something tells me you can more than hold your own." She hesitated for a moment, then set her handbag down and allowed him to help her to her feet. "Very well," she said, her tone playful. "But if I embarrass myself, the blame will be entirely yours." "I'll take my chances," he replied, leading her to the dance floor. The music wrapped around them as they moved, Eleanor's steps tentative at first, but growing more confident with each beat. The gentleman matched her pace, his movements graceful and respectful. They didn't speak, letting the music fill the space between them. Eleanor felt herself relax, her body responding to the rhythm, as a lightness she hadn't felt in years swept over her. When the song ended, the small crowd applauded, and Eleanor stepped back, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "It seems I haven't forgotten everything after all," she said, her cheeks flushed with exertion. The gentleman smiled. "You were wonderful. Thank you for indulging me." Eleanor inclined her head, her expression warm. "And thank you for reminding me how to feel the music." As she returned to her table, the weight of the night felt even lighter. The man returned to his seat as well, and though they didn't speak again, the connection lingered, a shared moment that required no further explanation. Eleanor checked the time on her watch, the polished gold glinting faintly in the dim light. It was growing late and she knew it was time to leave. Yet, she felt reluctant to step away from the sanctuary of the club, where the music and the warmth of shared human experience had wrapped around her so completely. She waved to the waiter, signaling for the bill. When the young man approached, however, he was holding more than just her check. In his other hand was a small note, folded neatly and addressed simply, "For Eleanor." The waiter placed both items on the table, his expression curious but polite. "Someone asked me to give this to you," he said. "They didn't leave their name, just this." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Thank you," she said, picking up the note with deliberate care. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. "Dear Mrs. Eleanor, I don't know if you'll ever fully understand the impact you've had tonight, but I wanted to tell you how much your presence has meant to me. Watching you carry yourself with such grace, seeing how you transformed what could have been a bitter moment into a powerful lesson, it's inspired me in ways I can't even put into words. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that kindness is a strength, not a weakness. Thank you for being exactly who you are. The world is better because of it. Sincerely, a grateful stranger." Eleanor's eyes lingered on the note, her heart swelling with emotion. She folded it carefully and tucked it into her handbag, alongside the other treasures she carried, a symbol of the life she had built, the memories she cherished, and the moments she continued to shape. The waiter returned with her check, and Eleanor reached for her wallet, pulling out enough cash to cover the bill along with a generous tip. As she stood to leave, she paused, looking back toward the stage where the band was preparing for their final set of the night. She walked toward the musicians, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. The saxophonist looked up as she approached, his expression curious but welcoming. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, her voice calm but purposeful. "Would you do me a favor?" "Of course, ma'am," he replied, his tone respectful. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor leaned in slightly. Her words meant only for him. The saxophonist's eyes widened slightly as he listened, but then he nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Consider it done," he said. Eleanor nodded her thanks, then made her way toward the door. She paused at the threshold, turning back one last time to take in the room, the soft glow of the lights, the hum of conversations, the quiet magic of the music. And then, with a small, satisfied smile, she stepped into the night, her heart light and her soul full. Behind her, the band began to play again, the saxophone leading with a melody that was rich, soulful, and filled with promise. It was a tune she recognized instantly, an old favorite, one she and Charles had danced to countless times before. Though she didn't turn back, the sound followed her as she walked, a reminder that life, like music, was always worth feeling deeply. The cool night air greeted Eleanor as she stepped onto the quiet street, her breath visible in the gentle chill. The city around her had begun to settle, the once bustling streets now dotted with only the occasional car or passerby. She tightened her coat around herself, feeling the comforting weight of her handbag against her side. The faint strains of music from the jazz club followed her for a moment, before fading into the rhythm of her footsteps. Eleanor walked with purpose, her thoughts wandering to the note tucked safely in her bag. A grateful stranger. The words lingered in her mind, stirring a quiet reflection. She didn't know who had written it, but the sentiment resonated deeply. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions could ripple outward, touching lives in ways she might never fully understand. Tonight had been proof of that, a night filled with moments where kindness had outshone cruelty, where grace had turned judgment into reflection. As she approached an intersection, she paused at the corner, gazing up at the glowing streetlights. They illuminated the path before her, their light soft and steady. She thought about how Charles had always compared life to a journey under streetlights. "You don't need to see the entire road ahead, Ellie," he would say. "Just focus on the light at your feet, that's enough to keep moving forward." The memory brought a soft smile to her lips as she crossed the street, her steps light and unhurried. She passed a bakery with its windows darkened for the night, and a bookstore with an old handwritten sign that read, "Closed, but come back tomorrow for more stories." It felt fitting somehow. Life was, after all, a series of stories, each one unfolding in its own time. Eleanor reached her destination, a modest brownstone with ivy climbing its facade. She climbed the steps slowly, her hand brushing the cool metal of the railing. Reaching the door, she retrieved her keys, the sound of the lock turning echoing softly in the stillness. Inside, the air was warm and familiar, scented faintly with lavender from the sachet she kept by the window. She set her handbag down on a small table by the door, her fingers lingering over its worn leather for a moment. Then she moved to the living room, where an old record player sat on a corner table, its polished wood glinting faintly in the low light. She reached for a record tucked neatly beside it, its sleeve bearing the image of a saxophonist mid-performance. Charles's favorite. With practiced ease, she placed the record on the turntable and lowered the needle. A soft crackle filled the room before the music began, a familiar, soulful tune that wrapped around her like an old friend. Eleanor sank into her favorite chair, her hands resting lightly on her lap as the melody filled the space. She closed her eyes, allowing the music to carry her back through the moments of the evening. The restaurant, the park, the jazz club, all of it seemed to blend seamlessly into the rhythm of the song. For a while, she simply sat there, letting the music weave its magic, her thoughts quiet and her heart full. The record reached its final notes, the music fading into the soft hum of silence. Eleanor opened her eyes, the stillness of the room grounding her in the present. She rose from her chair, moving to the window where the city lights stretched out before her like a sea of stars. Her reflection in the glass met her gaze, the faint lines on her face a testament to a life well lived, a life filled with both trials and triumphs. Eleanor thought of the people she had encountered tonight, the young diners at the restaurant, the waiter who had looked at her with such admiration, the strangers at the jazz club, and even the anonymous note tucked safely in her bag. Each interaction, each moment, felt like a thread in a larger tapestry, one she had spent a lifetime weaving with quiet determination. She placed her hand on the window pane, the cool glass grounding her as she whispered softly to herself, "Thank you, Charles, for teaching me how to carry the light." For a moment she stood there, the weight of her words settling over her like a gentle embrace. Then she turned and walked back to her handbag. She retrieved the note from the grateful stranger, smoothing its creased edges with delicate care. She placed it inside a small wooden box on the bookshelf, alongside other keepsakes from her journey, a photograph of Charles, a faded concert ticket, the brooch she had worn tonight. As she closed the lid, she felt a deep sense of peace. Tonight wasn't about seeking recognition or proving a point. It was about honoring the life she had built, the lessons she had learned, and the grace she chose to carry forward. Eleanor returned to her chair, settling in as the quiet warmth of the room enveloped her. Outside, the city hummed softly, its rhythm steady and unbroken. She reached for a book resting on the side table, its pages worn and familiar, and opened it to a marked passage. The words greeted her like an old friend, their meaning deeper now than ever before. The smallest light can illuminate the darkest night, and in its glow, the world remembers how to hope. With a contented sigh, Eleanor leaned back, the book resting lightly in her hands. Tonight she had been that light, and the world had felt its glow. In a single evening she transformed judgment into reflection, cruelty into kindness, and strangers into witnesses of grace. Her quiet strength proved that dignity and compassion are the most powerful answers to prejudice. Let this story remind us all, even the smallest act of kindness can leave a lasting impact. What will your next act of grace be?